Hey team, welcome back to the show. Today it is Coach Andrea and I talking through part three of why people are glute or quad dominant and how to fix it. So far, part one, we talked through kind of what can cause this, the issues that can stem from it. The last episode, we talked about glute dominant lifters who struggle to build quads and how it might fix that. Today, we're going to be chatting through how quad dominant lifters who struggle to build glutes can go about fixing the issue. So, if you fall into this camp, the issue you're probably experiencing is a squat or a lunge almost always turns into a more of a knee dominant movement where your quads take over. You're also probably someone with a longer tibia, longer tibias and shorter femurs, or a long torso and short legs. So, in this instance, when the goal is building glutes, basically we want to create more hip flexion or basically a greater stretch on your glutes by pushing your hips back away from your knees. So if we were to think of like what a squat pattern would look like, basically we would want your hips traveling backwards more so than your knees traveling forwards. Same would be true for a lunge. Before we get into solutions, anything else you would want to add there, Andrea?
This is something that I feel like I hear. Like I'm quad dominant. I can't build my glutes. But anatomically, I actually don't think that this is all that common for women. Would you
I don't
agree?
either. Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of it is just getting them executing the movements well and getting set up in the right position. But I actually don't think that most women are very quad dominant as far as limb lengths go.
Pretty sexist, but okay. Um, Really though, I agree. I think the other is a lot harder to fix if we were like very glute dominant trying to build quads where it seems like we are like sometimes really, really fighting just someone's structure. In this instance, it's almost always just, hey, you just haven't understood how to execute these movements properly to bias glutes more, but it is typically a much easier fix. So when we're looking at addressing this, number one, choose squat, hinge, and lunge movements that allow freedom of movement at the hip. So if you're naturally quad dominant due to limb lengths, basically your body wants to stay upright and push your knees forward, which will bias our quads more. Now to target glutes more, you basically need to break out of the upright bias and let the hips do more work. So again, this usually is easier to fix. And like we talked about, if you're glute dominant trying to build quads, it really helps to have your hips stable because it kind of forces us to push our knees forward. Whereas here, we don't really need so in that instance, like a hack squat is very helpful or a pendulum squat is very helpful. Where here, it is more so just about intention. We don't necessarily need any special equipment. Um, but if you are like naturally very quad biased, when we're looking at a squat pattern, for example, like in quad bias trying to build glutes, hey, like a glute bias squat might not be the best option for us because again, we talked through when we're squatting, that's just kind of like where the bar has to be for us to not fall over, right over kind of the arches of the feet. So there are still some equipment based considerations, but it's a lot easier as a whole for us to manipulate. Do you think does that make sense? You think you would?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. So basically the opposite fix of the quad bias, but if we have the ability to move at the hip, then just tweaking the setup can really get you into the right position. Is that kind of
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Or even like typically options that have your hip more supported aren't going to push your hips back further away from the
Right,
knees
yeah.
necessarily. But I mean, like, think of like if we did like a V squat, which I kind of think a V squat's shitty most of
Yeah,
the
I
time,
agree.
but that might like force that a little bit. But use the example of like an angled Smith machine. We talked about that last episode. That here could be a good, like, okay, this is gonna like that. Whereas we're not gonna be able to follow that same pattern if we're doing a barbell back squat, but if we're doing like a Smith machine squat, that is kind of forcing us more into that, like pushing the hips further back away from the knees. That might be a better option for us in this case. So next we were going to want to modify setup and positioning. So again, here we want to really emphasize hip flexion, which is basically us hinging, bending at the hips, less so than knee flexion. So really here, I mean, Again, the intention is, do you cue? Okay, so if we're cueing like a squat or a lunge, just let's just talk through like how would you cue? Okay, let's say we're doing a Smith machine rear foot elevated split squat or a split squat for glutes. Like, how are you going to cue someone to set that up for more glute bias?
So let's assume that the Smith machine goes just straight up and down.
Hmm.
I am typically going to have them set up the front foot so there's just a little bit more in front of the bar instead of directly under the bar, which would be more quad biased. And
That's
then
a really
the,
good shout. Let's actually touch on that just briefly. I'm
okay.
so sorry. Where like a Smith machine, if the bar, if you have your foot like arch of the foot right under the bar, or even further back still, we're going to be forced to just get a lot of knee flexion and drive our knee forward. So yeah, sometimes it does require we need to have our foot a little bit further forward in front of the bar and kind of manipulate our position around the bar. But I'm sorry, continue.
No, that's okay. And then, so typically I try to not give a ton of cues right off the bat. So usually in the notes, it's just going to say something like, make sure your front knee is at 90 degrees at the bottom. And then once we're watching videos, we'll give a little bit more direction based on how their body moves. So, most people will put that foot a little bit more in front of the bar just naturally to get that 90-degree bend at the bottom. But then some other things that we might start cueing once I'm seeing somebody move, I want to have their hips coming kind of down and back rather than straight down, which would be a little bit more quad bias or kind of hybrid between the two. Almost not really like a hinge, but like a little bit more hingy than a typical quad bias squat. We also want to make sure that ribs are staying down and usually chin is staying tucked down, because if we're looking forward or up and the ribs flare forward, a lot of times the pelvis is going to tip forward, and then we start to get more lower back that comes into it whenever we're pushing up out of the bottom of it. The back bench, we also want to make sure that it's the right height. So we don't want to run out of range of motion at the hip flexor before we get to the bottom of it, because that's going to short change the stretch that you get in the front glute. So if somebody's using a super high bench or has short legs, then we might want to elevate the front foot to give them more space to come down. It's essentially just making it so that the back bench doesn't seem so high.
Yep.
And then we don't want the back hamstring running into the calf too much in the back, because again, like if we're running into itself there, then we maybe had a little bit more range of motion we could have gotten before getting to the bottom. So if we just scoot it back just a little bit, then that's going to give you more room. So there's kind of a Goldilocks there between so much further back that the hip flexor is super stretched and we can't get down, or so close that you're all scrunched up together and you can't get into the right position.
Yeah, I think that like in the back leg, like at the bottom of the rep, that back knee, typically it plays out to where that back knee should be like a bit behind your hip. To
Yeah.
it shouldn't like if you're setting it up to where at the bottom of the rep your knee is like in your back knee is in front of your hip and you're like crunched up like your hamstring will be pressed up against your calf at that point. Back leg isn't far enough back. If it is like your back leg is basically straight, you're going to be running out of range of motion there. The keeping your ribs down is a really good one as well, because a lot of people do when they're like coming up, they like pull their head up, look towards the ceiling, and really arch their lower back and get more into the lower back. And I think it's important as well. Don't try to turn this into too much of a hinge. We're saying like hips should be moving backwards, but if you set this up well, basically if you think just bring your back knee straight down, your body will do what we need it to do. I do find people sometimes trying to turn this into too much of a hinge, and then we do get into our lower back a little bit more, where you don't necessarily like want to reach way back, which I don't
Yeah, I
think
actually don't ever give that as a cue.
I don't
It
either
was
anymore.
more just
Just
like a visual, like for what that looks like as the hip comes down and back. So
yeah,
yeah, that's a good
yeah.
point, because have never actually said that to somebody to do that.
I used to, and it always turned into like we're basically trying to do an RDL with like in a split squat setup, and it just doesn't. It can people just typically will tweak their backs with that. Um, uh, you have anything else on split squats?
We don't usually need any sort of like foot elevation or anything like that. Usually people can just kind of get right into the glute biased split squat with that. You want to make sure that you're not like pressing too much into your toes or too much into your heels or anything like that. but that's pretty much it.
Typically, if we have this set up, it'll depend on your anatomy a bit, but typically that if you're someone who's naturally very quad biased trying to build glutes, it will play out as your front shin will probably be very vertical, very upright, like your knee will be over your ankle at the bottom of the rep. If you're someone who's the opposite, it might still be like we get a little bit of knee flexion here and we're okay with it and we'll still be like biasing glute if that was the goal. But um moving on to leg presses then. Typically here, like if the goal was to just intentionally just bias glutes, I would typically want to set this up to where we have a 90-degree angle between the shins and the thighs at the bottom of the rep. So we kind of have a nice right angle there. Wouldn't be in a situation where we want people like feet as low as possible on the platform or like heels coming off the platform at the bottom of the rep. Typically, we're going to be getting a little bit more into our quads there. Whereas if we have our feet, so basically like right at the 90 degrees as well, at the bottom of the rep, 90-degree angle between shins and thighs. Does that make sense to you? Like me just saying 90-degree angle between, okay. That's also where your glutes will have the best leverage, be the strongest. Whereas again, if feet are lower, we'll get into our quads a little bit more. If our feet are higher, we'll just be putting ourselves in a weaker position.
And your hips are going to round up off the pad quite a bit sooner.
Yeah, we'll run out of range of motion a little earlier as well. Leg presses that move in more of an arc-like pattern can also be a really good option here. So like a Cybex squat press, any of the like squat presses where again, they'll move in a little bit more of an arc can be really good options here. The resistance profile, those will typically be a little bit different where they might load the mid-range to short a little bit more. I'm not concerned with that, honestly, because we have other movements like split squats, RDLs, where we'll bias the length and range a little bit more. So those are, I do really like a squat press if we are trying to build glutes more.
Yeah, I do too. It's annoying whenever we need to do more of a quad bias and that's all they have, but
also true.
It is a good one. It's very similar with the Prime one too. I will say I haven't seen a ton of those, but both of the gyms I've gone to have the Prime, and it's kind of arcing like that too. Yeah.
Out of your gyms, the only one I've ever seen that leg press in, and it's funny that it's in both
really?
of them. Yeah, must be an Arkansas thing,
I guess.
We talked about this on the podcast with Coach Baxter, doing some type of, if it is someone who struggles to just like get to that fully lengthened glute, glutes are just tight, short from being weak. Us doing an adductor stretch before something like an RDL or a movement where we're trying to like lengthen the glute more. So like basically hopping on the adductor machine and spending a little bit more time in the stretch position there can really force us to relax the glutes a bit more and get to more of that lengthened range. I guess last thing when it comes to like squats and lunges, we talked about how if you are someone who is more more glute bias trying to build quads, at the bottom of the rep coming up, your body is going to naturally kind of going to want to shift your hips back to get more into the glutes because your body will try to move to the position that it is the strongest in and kind of having to resist that. The same is true here where you're probably going to want to naturally want to shift forward towards your knees more, drive your knees forward more if we do have a tendency to be more quad dominant. But also what I would say is this is again an instance where more range of motion isn't necessarily better, right? Especially if you're more quad dominant and we're trying to build glutes. Like we can a lot of times like a squat, it might be like, hey, we're getting to like parallel and my glutes are fully lengthened here. Now for you to go any lower than parallel, basically what happens is your knees and hips have to actually start traveling forward. We're out of range of motion of the hips. Glutes are fully lengthened. The only way for us to continue to go further lower is to drive our knees forward. But again, that's going to get us into our quads more. We're going to shift tension away from the glutes. So it does oftentimes mean like, and in general, like more range of motion isn't always better. Just understanding, hey, what tissue are we kind of trying to bias here? Anything else you would add as far as setup and positioning goes? What about foot pressure? Anything like I see a lot of.
We just want to keep the full foot on the ground, especially like you mentioned RDLs. A lot of times either toes will come up or for me, the thing that I have to fight is I'll roll out to the outside of my feet, especially on the right side. And so if you think about your foot, like your big toe, your little toe, and your heel, we want to keep all three of those down on the ground because that's going to help keep your pelvis a little bit more stable, so that means your glutes are working better.
Love it. Um, I would say a lot of like on a lot of the lunge patterns. Typically, what I'm correcting is people's heel coming up. Yeah, that's super common. Almost always like we're getting on our toes. Same thing for like a glute bridge. A lot of times I see people where like, hey, our heels just keep leaving, and not the biggest deal like at the very end of the set if it happens like, but when it's like, hey, every rep we're just coming way up on our toes, we aren't going to be able to get as good an output from our glutes. I don't think I have anything else there. I guess the last thing would be just don't skip the lengthen range. This is another for like a split squat, very common where I mentioned more range of motion isn't better. But on the flip side, something I'm constantly correcting is, hey, we're actually still not like, we're cutting our range of motion off way too high. We're not even getting to like that fully stretched glute before we're coming back up, because that will be the hardest part of the rep for most of our free weight movements or like a Smith machine movement. Really, unless it's like a specialty equipment or like a squat press, like your normal leg presses, Smith machine movements, barbell movements, dumbbell movements, almost all of them are going to be the bottom of the rep. The length and range is going to be like what we're biasing. So making sure that, again, on the flip side, we're not cutting range of motion off too high is important. Do you use pre-exhaust stuff much when it comes to building glutes?
Yeah, I do. It really just depends so much on the person.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Sometimes I'll use either glutes or hamstrings before going into like an RDL, for example, because that's one where I find that people are a little bit scared to push the weight anyway.
Yeah.
And so we can kind of use the same weight for a better stimulus if we go into it a little bit pre-fatigued. Yeah, it really just depends. Sometimes we'll do a little bit of glutes before like a leg press. Honestly, I can't say it's something that I have a super clear cut. This is when I use it. This is when I don't, because it's just like many different factors based on their equipment and so on.
Yeah.
That we'll use it sometimes.
I don't really think of it as much as pre-exhaust, honestly, as, hey, the priority tissue I want to train first, typically. So I will a lot of times, if someone's trying to bias glutes more, I will oftentimes start with a short bias glute movement first. Not that I necessarily think that's how it has to go, but it's more so from an efficiency perspective. It's almost like we don't need to warm up as much for that. I can get you doing like a hip thrust or a 45-degree hip extension. We can hop into that pretty quickly, but that also just saves us time. Like we don't have to spend as much time like quote unquote warming up for like a leg press or rear foot split squat if we've already done that. And your glutes will, as a byproduct of that, be a little bit more fatigued. But so it's extremely common, like if we're trying to bias glutes, I would start with that. But it's less, honestly, I'm not thinking about it as much from like a pre-exhaust perspective. It's just like priority tissue, start with that, and then just saves us time throughout the training session.
Yeah, anytime I do shortened overload first before going into a more compound movement, I always kind of think about it as like a pre-exhaust. I hadn't thought
It
about that
definitely
from a
doesn't.
perspective of like, let's save some warm up time.
It does end up being that too, but like I do like to get people like we're in some way like we're going through full knee flexion and we're going through a good amount of hip flexion, right? So if I could do that instead of like we're doing some type of like heel elevator RDL or something as we warm up, you know what I mean? It kind of I like to like set it up like that quite frequently. So when we're looking at a checklist for a relatively complete week of glute training, let's say again we're spreading this over 2 lower body days. Typically, what I'd be looking for here is I want 2 movements that are going to challenge the glutes well in the length and range. Typically, would probably be one on each day. So, could be like a rear elbow split squat and an RDL. Typically, going to be like 2, maybe 3, probably depending on if we're doing like kickbacks and we're not really even mentioning like glute med stuff here, but probably at least 2 short bias movements as well. So, it could be like a hip thrust, a 45-degree hip extension, could just be hip thrust twice. And then we're probably going to end up having some mid-range work. If someone's really biasing, like really biasing glutes and have the recovery capacity, again, like a side back squat press, it's harder for us to, I mean, we could debate this. This a lot are going to be like mid to lengthened, but like the side back squat press is going to be like really nice. Like, hey, this is quite hard in the mid range, and it does drop off more in the lengthened. Honestly, that's really the only example I can think of that would be a really truly like. I don't know if I have any other good examples of that. Basically, if they have a squat press, probably gonna have them use the squat press once. Um, and then we might have other, maybe in like some of our quad bias movements as a byproduct, we also get like a little bit more mid-range challenge for our glutes there as well. So that's typically where those like 1 to 2 mid-range come from. Anything else you would add there?
I'm pretty in line with you on that. I would say that's kind of the average, and then there's a full spectrum of like, okay, somebody who is only training 3 days per week, we might have some fewer
Correct.
shortened overload movements in some cases, or if somebody's really biasing the glutes, I'll go pretty hard on shortened overload movements. Maybe even add those in on like an upper body day for some people.
Yeah,
we'll
same.
finish off the day with some glutes or start the day with some glutes, something like that. But this is kind of like a middle of the range template, I'd say.
For sure. Okay. So talking movement selection, again, you have your like glute bridges, 45-degree hip extensions, things like that. More short bias work. We're really talking about like your squat and lunge patterns here. So my first choices typically are going to be some type of RDL, a barbell RDL, dumbbell RDL, trap bar RDL, depending on what works best for the person. I like a single leg press a lot. Very similar to the split squat, which I also really like a split squat. A Smith machine rear foot elevated split squat I like a lot. If the person has trouble stabilizing the hip, and that's like something we need to address, dumbbell rear foot elevated split squat without the stability can be a good tool there. Smith machine reverse lunge I like. Honestly, I don't like that as much. I still like it. I still program it a lot. I don't like it as much as like a rear foot elevated split squat because it's just a little bit less stable. Sometimes I find people have trouble pushing that as close to failure with the glute being the limiting factor. Not that that's always a bad thing. I like a squat press, a leg press. Anything else you would add as far as kind of first choices there if we have availability?
I still really like a little bit more of a bent knee RDL too. I know that you don't love those as much unless somebody just naturally moves that way.
No, I don't. I don't mind
Which I
them at
guess
all.
in this case we are talking about somebody who's a little more quad
actually hate them,
biased.
to be clear. There's nothing wrong with them.
Well, yeah, I mean, anyways, so especially if somebody has like a trap bar, I really like a trap bar RDL or like a trap bar deadlift where we're not going all the way to the floor
Yeah,
because
I do
that puts
too.
them in a really naturally glute biased position.
I literally just programmed this at a client where at first phase we were doing a barbell RDL, and I find just like it gives you, it's so much easier to get the movement pattern we want, but also people load it up so much better where sometimes the barbell RDL specifically, I don't know if people just think of it, there's like a mental barrier around loading it heavy. I think a lot of people just hurt their backs like trying to do some type of barbell deadlift in the past. Whereas when we go to the trap bar, it's like, okay, well now we're doing the exact same movement that we wanted you doing, but people aren't as afraid to load it heavy. It just seems like it's easier to get that outcome sometimes. I like just made that swap.
Yeah, that's a good one. And then a front foot elevated static lunge.
Okay.
I'll use quite a bit now at this point. I've started using that a lot more. I think that's it.
Okay. So then when we're talking like minimalist equipment options, so if we're in a garage gym, honestly, most of these we can do there. We could do barbell, dumbbell, trap bar RDLs, glute bias, rear foot elevated split squat. You could use a barbell or dumbbells if we don't have a Smith machine. Hand supported glute lunges, which is basically like you have a dumbbell in one hand, you're holding onto a bench with the other, you're doing a reverse lunge. That back foot is floating a little bit more, almost like emulating what we could do if we were doing it on a Smith machine. Uh, Lots of barbell glute bridges typically going to be quite common there. Honestly, again, it's a lot easier to do this with like minimalist equipment than it is quads. Anything else you would add there?
Yeah, really the biggest limiter in that case is just the amount of weight that somebody has. The movements
Yeah.
aren't really that hard to
No.
get done.
A lot of times it's like, hey, you need heavier dumbbells or we're going to have to start loading this with a barbell. It's just the
Yeah.
biggest thing we run into. Any client examples here that you can think of with like, hey, we were quite quad dominant, and this is what we've done to help build glutes?
So, are you specifically talking about from a home gym?
No.
Oh, okay. Um, so I do have one person who just anatomically is much more quad dominant. So my client Julie, she was working out in like a an apartment gym, so a little bit more limited, and then has been in more of like a Planet Fitnessy type of gym. Actually, I think it might be Planet Fitness. I can't really fully see the equipment, um, but to get her into more quad bias positions, just some intentional cueing around the RDLs has been really helpful. She actually moves super well, so that's been like not all that hard to get her into a good position there. And then in things like the split squat, so she's using a Smith machine for the split squat. She was one where on the way back up, she just kind of naturally shifted forward a little bit more. And so we've kind of just played around with foot positioning and cueing there, and that's been great. And she's built her glutes up quite a bit. And she's also a runner, which can sometimes make it a little bit more difficult to build up the lower body in general, but also the glutes. And she's built a lot of muscle.
Oh yeah. Yeah, again, I truly think it is just understanding so much more here is just understanding like the intention behind the movements than it is like even in the proper setup. But again, it's less like we talked through like my client example of my client who's very glute dominant trying to build quads, and there was like so many things we messed around with like the heel wedges and all this stuff. Whereas it is oftentimes a lot easier here once you understand intention. So biggest thing here, we can't change our anatomy, but with intention, the right setup, we can change what gets trained. And it's not always just a matter of now. Actually, almost everyone does need to train harder, so it is oftentimes a matter of that as well. But also
Maybe not
understanding what,
more.
yes, not necessarily more. Oftentimes it is less, but better, and understanding what tissue we're actually trying to build. Um, any final thoughts, takeaways before we wrap it up?
So this is a situation where having an outside pair of eyes on your movement videos makes such a huge difference. So we've talked through like different movements that we like to use, how you can set those up, and that's great and helpful. But being able to have somebody with an objective eye look at your videos and intentionally like put you in the right position and see the things that you might be missing, especially if you're someone who's like, man, I've been trying to grow my glutes for like 5 years and I feel like I'm doing all the right things and nothing's happening, would probably be helpful for you to just get an outside perspective, to have eyes on your videos, be pushing you on the intensity, have the right programming and volume for the equipment specifically that you have available, and start to make some progress there.
Absolutely. I feel like so often when people hire a coach, it's just like they're just handed a workout plan and okay, let's hope the best happens. And we're not going to change these things if you're not actually coached through them, where this is actually how we coach. We're looking at your body, your structure, your setup, your execution, and helping you adjust all of those things. We're not just guessing. We're looking at your videos. We're adjusting your lifts. We're giving you actual feedback. That's how we actually build a physique. So, sick of being stuck, ready to change, hit the link in the show notes to apply to work with our team. If you enjoy the show, do us a huge favor, leave us a 5-star rating and review, and we will catch you guys next time.